It's time for every episode of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic Season 4 reviewed. If you clicked this video, welcome! And if you came here for my Paper Mario challenges, hate to break it to ya, but you're on the wrong channel. So you have two options. You can dislike the video and be on your way, because by doing that, YouTube will start recommending you my Little Pony content, or check the card in the top right corner and check out my new channel Phantomay. I upload Paper Mario and Bud Fables videos there, so feel free to watch those videos if you're interested on that channel and not here. If at all for some reason you're interested in this, awesome! Though I highly doubt it. So Season 4 actually hosts the first episode of this show I've ever watched. And because of this, yeah, I was not really bothered by the fact that Princess Twilight Sparkle was a thing because, well, when I got into the show at first, she already was a princess. That episode is Castlemania, by the way. Anyway, from this point onward, there will no longer be any half seasons. All the 6 seasons after Season 3 will all have 26 episodes. And Season 4 is where the show starts getting interesting. We see overarching arcs being introduced, other arcs being progressed, some rather out there experimentation with the characters themselves, and who knows what else. As always, we have good episodes, okay episodes, and nightmare episodes. Now let's gallop into these reviews. Episodes 66 and 67, Princess Twilight Sparkle. Twilight investigates the disappearance of Celestia and Luna when the Everfree Forest attacks. First off, I really appreciate how Twilight being a princess doesn't change her personality at all. She's still our ever so lovable egghead as a unicorn, and I'm really glad this corporate mandate didn't really change anything for the worse. But yeah, the story. The Everfree Forest is attacking because of Discord's plunder seeds, which we learn in part 2, and Twilight, along with us the audience, learn about this MacGuffin called the Tree of Harmony, which apparently needs the elements of harmony to survive. There is a lot of very interesting information we learn in the first part of this episode. For example, the Summer Sun celebration only reminded Princess Celestia of when she had to banish her sister Princess Luna. And seeing that flashback where Princess Celestia is crying on the inside and a little bit on the outside, seeing that she has to banish her little sister, you can imagine this took a really big toll on her after Friendship is Magic Part 2 actually played out and we saw how she was crying to see a reunion. Though unfortunately, this also kind of shoots my idea of how long a moon is supposed to last in the foot. Because apparently, everything between Friendship is Magic Part 1 and Princess Twilight Sparkle took place in a year. Like, it's not outright stated to be only a single year, but the dialogue very heavily implies that. Princess Celestia speaks of the Summer Sun celebration as if it's only been 1 year since the last time it happened. Despite the fact that we cycled through all the seasons in just the first season of the show, had at least 2 winters, and presumably at least 2 Apple Family reunions that are supposed to be 2 years apart. Yeah, forget trying to understand how time works in this stupid freaking show. I just have to say also, this episode has absolutely incredible animation and shading. At least in the beginning, and in the flashback where Twilight was watching Princess Celestia and Luna having their showdown. The animators must have put a lot of effort into making this look really good. Speaking of the flashback, it gives us some interesting context to work off of too. Like, Princess Luna becoming Nightmare Moon didn't really get to do very much aside from her Princess Celestia and their fight. And considering when she got to come back from Nightmare Moon and then becoming basically Nightmare Moon for like 1 night before becoming Princess Luna once again, all she really did was attack some guards and left like Tickle Me Elmo. So yeah, in reality, it looks like Princess Celestia really only had it the hardest. Also, while Twilight did not change very much, it seems that her friends do have a different opinion of her now. We see this play out in part 2 actually, where Applejack is the one to suggest that maybe it's for the best that Twilight stay behind in Ponyville while her friends look for the Tree of Harmony. Like, of course, all of them is important, but Twilight's kind of priceless now being a princess. It's actually kind of disheartening considering that Twilight doesn't like to see herself above any other pony. Now, that doesn't mean their decision made any sense because, after all, they kind of need both Twilight and her crown to use the elements of harmony, but I guess they just didn't really think that far through. And this brings me to Discord. My god, this Discord is so freaking cool. As it turns out, even though Princess Celestia is not going to be with Twilight's mentor anymore, Discord has his own plans to mold Twilight to being a good princess. Not only in reaffirming Twilight's bond with her friends, but also adopting a similar style to Princess Celestia, namely in how he shows but doesn't really tell Twilight what's going on. And if we can expect this Discord going forward, I will be a very happy camper with his reformation. I only really have one problem with this episode, and that's with Pinkie Pie. Okay, I get that she's supposed to be the element of laughter and the comic relief of the show, but please for the love of Celestia, don't make her stupid. Like, in Return of Harmony, she was silly, but she was still really cute and fun to watch. After all, I can totally relate to loving chocolate milk rain, and even then she knew when to actually cut it out. Same with the Crystal Empire actually. Except there it felt more creative and less juvenile. That aside, if this episode will be this good, even with Pinkie Pie being my one and only complaint, I am expecting very great things from Season 4 going forward. And I'm really curious to see how this overarching plot with the keys goes along too. These 6 keys will be found throughout the entirety of Season 4, and what else can I say except that I'm really hyped? With that being said, let's dig right in. Episode 68, Castlemania. The main 6 wander the castle of the two sisters unbeknownst to each other. My feelings towards this episode are pretty lukewarm all things considered, which is weird considering that this is one of the most chaotic episodes of the whole show. Twilight, not too long after Princess Twilight Sparkle, wants to look for information on the box that came out of the Tree of Harmony, and Celestia gives her a hint to try to castle the two sisters. Applejack and Rainbow Dash, meanwhile, go there on a dare basically to see who can last the longest in that castle. And Rarity and Fluttershy go there basically to try and find some tapestries for Rarity. And from there, it's mostly just a bunch of jokes. And I guess watching these characters lose their sanity over time. It's entertaining enough, though I'll be honest, I very rarely ever laughed. Yeah, I guess that's my biggest problem with this episode. I just did not find it very funny. This episode is good enough to be considered okay in my opinion, but that's really as far as I'd go. I feel like my biggest problem with this episode is just that despite the pairings, there really isn't very much interaction until the very end. There were a few moments like when, say, Fluttershy and Rarity got trapped in that cell, and Rarity stuff spooked Rainbow Dash, but I just wish there were more moments like that. Like, there's a lot of potential for some really physical comedy. Instead, this episode seems more focused on the atmosphere and trying to set up this castle as being really creepy, but it just never felt like it really went far enough in that direction. And it's really strange too because they established these Star Spiders really early in the episode, Fluttershy outright mentions them, and Spike feels creeped out by them, but they don't really go very far with that concept. There's also the Pony of the Shadows, which we learned is Pinkie Pie of course, but there's also this other ominous shadow that's at the end of the episode, which we learn later in the show is actually the villain of Season 4, or at least it's heavily implied. Just saying, if you didn't want to put your main characters in any physical harm, that thing at the end of the episode had lots of potential for slapstick. And so this episode just reaches a very awkward middle ground, not being very funny, but not being very scary either. And it's a shame because this episode was actually really close to being good. It's also worth mentioning that this episode also establishes that the main 6 will be keeping their own journal too. And this just so happens to be replacing the letters to Princess Celestia. Well, this sure will be an interesting development. Episode 69. Daring Don't. Rainbow Dash meets Daring Do in person. 4th episodes of any season in this show tend to have a pretty shaky track record with me. And this episode is actually very controversial. People really don't like Daring Don't. So this episode is a clear-cut nightmare episode, right? Heck no! Let's get this out of the way first. This episode is really freaking funny. I love a lot of the more vocal humor in this episode, especially from Fluttershy. It can be a little dark, but I just think that her delivery is absolutely fantastic. She plays the straight mare to the situation extremely well, and is an absolute joy to sit through. It's also really fun to see both Rainbow Dash and Twilight be such avid fans of Daring Do, especially considering the fact that Twilight introduced Rainbow Dash to Daring Do books to begin with. That moment near the middle of the episode where Rainbow Dash and Twilight are debating the books about whether or not Daring Do really needs their help is absolutely spot on. On that note, Daring Do is actually real, and personally, I have no objection to this. I mean seriously, there have to be more capable ponies than the main 6, right? And nothing really implies that she can't exist either. It's also really fun to see her and Rainbow Dash bounce off of each other. She looks so actively annoyed by Rainbow Dash's presence, but she takes it really well. It's also just really cute to see this dorky side of Rainbow Dash again. I mean, it is really like her to act this way. She fangirls over the Wonderbolts all the time. She's also been shown to be very eager to please her idols in episodes like Sonic Rainboom and The Best Night Ever. So yeah, her actions are really believable in this episode. Yes, including the part where she's sulking away after Daring Do gets captured. Now, I'm not the kind of person to bring up the elements of harmony in relation to a pony's personality, but you have to imagine, a pony with loyalty like Rainbow Dash would feel really disappointed in themselves for failing their idol. It also leads to a very good moral too. You can't downplay your own accomplishments just because you're not your hero, which is actually a really mature moral to teach the kids. And heck, at the risk of firing some shots, I thought this episode did the moral better about learning to lean on your friends better than Applebuck season did. There's just one itty bitty little thing that I'm a bit iffy on. If Daring Don't preaches about how you can't trust any pony, why does she publish her adventures in books? Like, I can infer that she probably does it because, let's say the books stop coming, people would know that she actually lost or something. Maybe the author would just stop writing the books. Real talk, that line never made any sense to me. I mean, I could complain that Princess Celestia's not doing anything about all these villains, but if Daring Do always wins, is she really needed? That aside, this episode was great. Episode 70, Flight to the Finish. The Kingdom Crusaders compete to carry the flag for the Equestria Games. Wow. I'll be honest, the first time I watched this episode, I respected it. The second time though, I felt, well, more than respect, but appreciation. In case you're wondering, Scootaloo is disabled. She's a Pegasus that cannot fly. And it's this episode that specifically confirms that. We've seen hints in previous episodes, but yeah, she really is disabled. And I'll be honest, it gives me chills down my spine to think that this episode is basically teaching kids to not let your disability own you, but to own your disability. It hits especially hard considering that I have autism. Not as severe as Scootaloo's condition, but I can really see myself rooting for her. And my god, Diamond Tiara needs to die on a spit, roasting on an open fire, and fed to the manticores. I know I'll never get my wish, but she did lose, and I guess I'll just have to settle for that. And you know what? Good enough. I'm happy to see CMC manage to win despite all that they were put through. It's also just really encouraging to see how the CMC have grown so much over the course of the year. It's become extremely clear how strong their bond really has grown. Also, that song, Hearts as Strong as Horses, is kick butt. Like, wow, that's a great freaking song. Really, if I had any complaints, it's just that the CMC gave up on their friend a little too quickly, I think. Particularly because if Scootaloo doesn't come to the Crystal Empire, the CMC are forced to lose anyway because their routine needed Scootaloo. Don't get me wrong, this is still a good episode, but it seemed very short-sighted of Scootaloo to not really think about that. Then again, Diamond Tiara got so far in her head, she just couldn't think straight, I guess. This also gives Rainbow Dash a really good moment to shine, too. Which, on top of being thematically appropriate, since Rainbow Dash and Scootaloo are, I guess, honorary sisters now, is also just really touching. Rainbow Dash is basically telling Scootaloo that whether or not you can fly, you're awesome just the way you are. Very fitting words considering the last episode we saw was Daring Don't. If I had anything else to compliment this episode on, it's that Scootaloo doesn't overcome her disability by the end of the episode. Because in the real world, these disabilities can stick with you for life. That would have really cheapened the message, and on top of that, it shows that just because you can't do as much as others, doesn't mean you can't do anything. So keep your chin up high, and keep striving to do as best as you possibly can. Because after all, just because you have to work harder, doesn't make your work is in vain. I also find it really funny seeing Rainbow Dash try to hold in her excitement, even though she just wants to scream how much she loves the CMC's routine. Though I kinda have to wonder how the CMC didn't pick up on that. It was also really fun to see Miss Harshwitty break character just to be a little more excited than normal. What can I say? It's nothing to be ashamed of to see kids do their part and do it well. Episode 71, Power Ponies. Spike and the main six get sucked into the Power Ponies comic book. No, not another Spike episode. This season was doing so well. It had to happen at some point. So let's talk for a bit on why I dislike Spike's episodes so much. Very often, these episodes revolving around Spike tend to make his friends either insensitive or insultingly stupid. And this episode unfortunately falls into the latter category. Listen, I wanted to like this episode. I really did. Because there's a lot of potential here. For example, the superpowers the main six do get from the comic book world do have some relation to their actual abilities in real life. But there's a certain twist to them that makes them more difficult to control at first. Except for like Twilight and Pinkie Pie, those are basically interchangeable, and in the sense of Twilight, she even got nerfed. But Rainbow Dash is already a weather pony. Applejack is extremely skilled with a lasso, Rarity is incredibly creative, and Fluttershy is a very defensive character. When the chips are down and her friends are in danger, Fluttershy can get very scary. And these characters, they are already practically superheroes in reality. They don't really need any extra superpowers. Admittedly, the latter two got represented extremely poorly because, after all, Rarity is not an idiot. So the fact that she thinks of Batiste at the first thing, let's just say I'd expect this from Pinkie Pie, not Rarity. And even from Pinkie Pie, it'd be out there for her. But then there's Fluttershy, and admittedly, this actually really pissed me off. For whatever reason, any defensiveness that Fluttershy had for her friends is completely gone this episode. It bugs me here because as early as Season 1, in episodes like Dragonshy and Stairmaster, Fluttershy has proven to be very brave when it counts. Especially in Dragonshy, where she was up against one of her own phobias. This episode makes it out as if she completely regressed as a character. For real, if you wanted to portray Fluttershy like this, have this be an episode where both Spike and Fluttershy pair up. Because personally, I can't see Spike feeling useless. Yes, he has had moments where he's been extremely useful, like in the Crystal Empire, but it's also very easy to fall into the mental trap of thinking you're not good enough for your friends. And Spike being a baby very well could learn this lesson. But that's another thing. Fluttershy has also frequently felt useless in her life. And if not useless, she's also been shown to have a very low opinion of herself. And when she finally does bring into action, it's over something as innocuous as a tiny little firefly getting swatted out the way. It's supposed to be funny, but here's the problem. It's not funny to see a character be so regressive. I know that Fluttershy is better than this. It just feels like a disservice to Fluttershy's character to portray her like she's completely weak and helpless. Or in this case, that she'd care more about a bug than her own friends that she's known for years now. You know what could have been really cool? If the Maniac tried to swat Spike out of the way and he got hurt. And see, what if her friends gets hurt is what pushes Fluttershy over the edge. That would be much more in tune with her character and also portray her as being righteously pissed off. It's also a subtle way to communicate to the audience that Spike's friends really care about him. Listen, I could talk about this episode for a very long time, pointing at what I didn't like about it, because there is just that many things to say about this episode and why it sucks. But for all the things I don't like about this episode, there is one thing from Twilight that I really do like seeing, and that's that despite Spike being Humdrum in the comic book world, Twilight tells Spike it's a good thing he really isn't Humdrum. On top of that, she's also consulting Spike for information about the Maniac's whereabouts, understanding that Spike is the most knowledgeable person in the group right now. If nothing else, it's good to see that Twilight at least respects Spike as a person. Unfortunately, in making Spike the smart one, they also had to dumb everyone else down really hard. There's a moment in this episode where all these ponies see this hairspray that can freeze them in their tracks, and then after seeing Rainbow Dash be frozen right where she's flying, the rest of the main four charge straight at her and then get frozen themselves. What did you actually think would happen? And I say main four because Fluttershy actually had the common sense to hide. Yeah, my one positive thing to say about this episode doesn't really matter for much, doesn't it? Inversely, there's more things I could complain about, like the fact that Twilight tells Spike to get some rest, just to not need his help for the castle with the two sisters when they're cleaning it up, even though he very well could have a reason to actually be there and do some work. Or really, just the fact that it was implied that Twilight let Spike wander through the Everfree Forest all alone, despite the fact that we, the audience at least, would assume that she and Spike would travel together to the Everfree Forest and to the castle. Also, that bucket joke with the comic relief bit was not funny. But in the interest of time, let's just move on. I'm just disappointed a winning streak of episodes being good just had to be broken here. Yeah, this is a nightmare episode. What was even the point of having this episode take place in the castle of the two sisters? Really? An enchanted comic book store? That's where you got this book? At least put some of those dusty old books to good use. Episode 72, Bats. Applejack and Fluttershy butt heads over dealing with vampire fruit bats. Alright, here's a confession. For all these episodes up from season 1 to now, I've only been watching them twice, not thrice. This episode though, I do feel like I have to watch it 3 times. This has to be the absolute hardest time I've had thinking of stuff to talk about. And I'm not really sure why. I think the story is very solid. What's going on here is just that Applejack wants to protect her farm from these fruit bats because they're eating her apples. And by eating, I mean they're just sucking them dry. She enlisted her friends for help, but Fluttershy isn't really all for this idea. Instead, she sympathizes with the bats because they're doing this just because that's how they survive. In a way, this episode reminds me a lot of Over a Barrel from season 1. Except that here, A, it's Applejack and Fluttershy butting heads, not Applejack and Rainbow Dash, and B, both parties actually have a reason to be here. I guess on the note of previous episodes, I do like the moral this episode teaches a lot, especially on Fluttershy's end. Namely in how you shouldn't go along with something you don't personally agree with. You know, it's basically anti-peer pressure, which I can definitely respect, especially compared to previous episodes. The moral that Applejack learns is also really good, and if I may add, very applicable in today's society. It's not uncommon that people want to have the best solution in the shortest possible amount of time. And look what that cost Applejack, her prized massive apple. Unfortunately for this episode, this is where the writing gets kinda messy. All Applejack wanted to do was protect her produce, and ultimately, she's the one to suffer the consequences for it. And considering that she's dealing with bats, which can be seen as vermin for her and the others that actually are in favor of getting rid of them, yeah, that's not a very good message to send to kids. And I'll talk about this more later in the review. There were also just some really cool moments in general. I really like the song and how it contrasts like the bright and colorful Fluttershy moments where she's singing positively up the fruit bats, and the dark, gloomy, and ominous side with Applejack and the rest of her friends singing about stopping the bats from doing their thing. It's a really cool way to contrast the two sides butting heads with each other. It's also cool to just see these writers get very experimental with what they do with these characters. Like turning Fluttershy into a bat-pony hybrid is just really interesting to me. And it just feels like a very creative way for her story to be integrated into this episode. There's some good jokes here too, like with Spike congratulating himself for helping out despite the fact that he did absolutely nothing. I don't know why, I just find it really funny. I do find it morally questionable though how Twilight thinks to take away the desire to eat from the vampire fruit bats. Like if they're not eating apples, what are they eating? Yeah, they look fine after the fact, but I have to wonder what they're eating now. Realistically speaking, Fluttershy's occupation is caring for animals. If she's so fond of these fruit bats, wouldn't it make more sense than for her to just take the bats into her cottage or something? If a scene like that existed between, say, Applejack talking about stopping the bats and Twilight coming up with a spell to stop the bats from eating the food, I feel like the story would be a lot more complete. And if she wouldn't want to do that, at least call Fluttershy out for not being willing to do what she'd expect of Applejack. After all, it's not like she can commune with the fruit bats either, which on a side note would explain why she cannot commune with the animals in The Best Night Ever. Without it, the message is kinda muddied as a result. This is also just a nitpick, but isn't Spike a baby dragon, and as a result he doesn't really like to stay up late? Like, I may hate Aloysius, but you introduced him for a reason, so why not use him at night? That just bugged me when we saw him in the stakeout. Originally, I was gonna call this episode good, but now? No, I think it's closer to okay than good. It's not that the message is the worst executed possible, but I do think the story needs some serious work. Yes, Flutterbat may be cool, but I much prefer having a more cohesive story overall. All in all, I do have to extend my kudos to Meriwether Williams. I say this because she's not credited as the writer for this episode. No, Megan McCarthy is, and that was an error. But this was a good parting gift. Oh yeah, this was the last episode she wrote for the show. And even though she wrote my most hated episode of My Little Pony so far, I'm kinda sad to see her gone. Episode 73, Rarity Takes Manehattan. Rarity's generosity is put to the test when she gets taken advantage of. This is the first of the key episodes of the season. Yeah, remember that big boss that came out of the Tree of Harmony in Princess Twilight Sparkle? This is what that was leading up to. And the first element to be put to the test, Rarity's generosity, entails what's basically a rival taking advantage of her generosity and trying to steal her fashion line. Let me start off by just saying that I really like this episode. There's lots of little things I just really appreciate, like how when Rarity got tickets to that play, she thought of Spike too. If you were to count those tickets at the beginning of the episode, you'll count that there's 7. Also, there are some ponies that Rarity shows a very generous spirit to in her song, Generosity, that do return to favor later in the episode. Yeah, there are some details I wish were included, like maybe getting to see Babs again, but that's largely inconsequential. Something I have to say is I really love the story structure of this episode. Everything feels very smooth. From getting the main 6 into Manehattan, to the story's pacing, even the animation once again just looks really good. Honestly, I feel kinda spoiled to see the season 4 right now because this just looks a far cry above anything from season 3 and below. And then we get to Rarity's foil, Suri. Or specifically, Suri Polomare. What she does is pretty heinous, stealing Rarity's fabric and her fashion line, and in general just plays really dirty. It's an interesting contrast between her, who's really just looking out for herself and herself alone, and Rarity, who goes out of her way to look out for others. She even kinda rubs off on Rarity a bit, which really takes a toll on Rarity's friends. Personally, I can't get mad at Rarity for this. Yes, she is guilt tripping, and yes, it's not the best to watch our main characters be forced to basically work in a labor camp, but her motivations are much stronger in this episode than, say, the Ticketmaster or Apple Family Reunion. And dare I say, it's leagues above Sweet and Elite. And by the end of it all, she still does learn that it's not worth letting one person ruin your generous spirit for everyone else. Which, if something else, is a really cute moral, and I also really like how she makes it up to her friends too. It should be no surprise to anyone, but this in my opinion is a very good episode. And I love Rarity's portrayal here too. She even gained a new assistant, Miss Pamela. And it's really cool to see that Rarity's generosity did inspire others to be more generous too. Long live Best Unicorn. Though I have to say, how is it that a princess like Twilight can't get a cab? Episode 74, Pinkie Apple Pie. Pinkie Pie discovers she may be related to the Apple family. This has to be one of the sweeter episodes so far in the season. I just find it really cute how Pinkie Pie looks so eager and so happy at just the possibility that she's related to Applejack and the Apple family. Though it also begs some more questions, like, she also has her own family back at home, so did anything happen between Pinkie Pie and the Rocks? Those questions aside, the conflict is basically that Applejack and her family want to put on a good impression for Pinkie Pie if they want to make sure she feels welcome at their family. And my god, this just hits really close to home. Everyone, of course sans Pinkie Pie, has their own contributions to the conflict. Big Mac packed so heavy the wagon couldn't take all the weight, Apple Bloom lost the map, Granite Smith took every pony down a dark cave that was really scary, and Applejack broke their wheel. But all the same, Pinkie Pie is just so optimistic, it just brings such a happy atmosphere to this whole episode. And you think she's just really naive, but no, she's not. She's actually taking this very maturely. She clearly has her own ideas about what a good family is supposed to be like, saying things like, when it comes to family, you make the time for them. As well as being perfectly aware that the Apples could argue a lot, but they're still able to stick together and work through their conflicts. It reminds me a lot about Sisterhood of Social actually, which portrays family relationships pretty realistically. I have to say, by the way, I find it really funny how Applejack basically wants to portray their family to Pinkie Pie as if living in Full House. But the fact that they do bicker and they do argue and is a lot more like realistic as to how they actually act, that's what really sells this episode as being good to me. That aside, there's some good jokes in this episode too. I love Pinkie Pie's little freak out when she thinks that she and Applejack are actually related. Also seeing her take that scroll from that pile of scrolls and then just never tipping over. Note to self, never play Jenga with Pinkie Pie. I'm not sure if I mentioned this yet, but this episode has a lot of heart to it. That scrapbook that Pinkie Pie is keeping is just such a cute touch. And it's just lovely to see how much of an emphasis that she puts on memories and having with the Apple family too. Yeah, the ending's kinda bittersweet. We don't really know for certain if Applejack and Pinkie Pie are actually related. As a matter of fact, I don't think we ever actually do learn the truth about that. But just like Applejack will say, she's an apple to the core, and that's all that matters. Episode 75, Rainbow Falls. Rainbow Dash must choose between flying with her idols and her friends for the Equestria Games. It's worth mentioning that not only does this episode further the Equestria Games arc, but this episode also tests Rainbow Dash's loyalty to her friends. That's to say, this is another key episode like Rarity takes Manehattan. And given this episode's involvement with the arcs of this series, it's really important that this episode gets it right. And did it get it right? Nope. So there are lots, and I mean lots of problems with this episode. But before we get into the continuity issues, let's talk about the story and why it just does not work. The story wants to present itself as if Rainbow Dash would rather spend time with her friends in the Equestria Games or just play to win. And there's lots of dialogue to suggest that's the case. From Twilight's little counseling about how Applejack, Rarity, and Pinkie Pie are basically coming to the Equestria Games for Rainbow Dash, and they can't do that if Rainbow Dash doesn't stay loyal to her team to get Ponyville to qualify, to how Fluttershy even outright admits that she came to the Equestria Games to qualify for Rainbow Dash. However, there's a major problem with this conflict. This is not a personal endeavor for Rainbow Dash. This is something that she's doing for the glory of her entire town. It's even outright mentioned that if she does not qualify for the Equestria Games on the aerial relay team, then Ponyville won't even get to participate in the Equestria Games. And given this fact, brings a bunch of other issues with this episode that all add up to a very big mistake. Here's where continuity really bites this episode in the tail. Remember Fight to the Finish? That episode was establishing who'd be carrying the flags for their town. That episode came before this one. So you mean to tell me that if Rainbow Dash and her team fails to qualify for the Equestria Games, would that mean that Scootaloo, Rainbow Dash's honorary sister, and the Kingdom of Crusaders as a whole would not get to go? If it does, then that's extremely irresponsible on Rainbow Dash's part, because she also chose some of the weakest flyers that Ponyville had to offer. Apparently, we're gonna forget about the fact that A, both biceps can fly just fine in Hurricane Fluttershy and Wonderbolt's Academy, B, Fluttershy can be as fast as Rainbow Dash if the situation calls for it, and C, and most importantly, the girl has stage fright. And please, do not try to act like she got over it after one episode. She didn't. I know this because not too long in this episode, Pinkie Pie throws her cheers out for Fluttershy and bulk biceps, and Fluttershy specifically called Pinkie Pie's cheering scary. Despite the fact that she knows darn well, or at least she should know, that she's going to a competitive event that's equivalent to the Olympics, where thousands of spectators will be watching your every move. Now, I wouldn't rule out the possibility of Fluttershy wanting to participate in the Equestria Games altogether, but here's the problem: you can't just drop Fluttershy in a position where she would obviously hate to be in without explaining it first. I have to bring up Hurricane Fluttershy here again. because for whatever reason, this episode holds that episode in utter contempt. In Hurricane Fluttershy, she barely would do a civic duty for her whole town, and that was only because she was outright needed there. Before that, it took an immense amount of prodding for her to finally come out of her own cottage. Even later in the episode, up until the climax, she didn't want to participate in the tornado because she was afraid that the little she could contribute wouldn't be enough. Yes, the moral was about how the little you can contribute could still make all the difference. But in the Olympics, a strictly competitive event, you want the best flyers you can find. And it really does not help because this episode also goes to great lengths to show that Fluttershy and Bulk Biceps should not be here. I mean, coming up with a reason would not be easy, but it's not impossible either. Just show Rainbow Dash trying to find ponies to fly over on the aerial relay team, but she can't find anyone. And Fluttershy, seeing this, puts herself out there. Make it clear that the reason that she's volunteering is because she wants to make Rainbow Dash happy. And if you're still worried about Fluttershy's stage fright, here's the important point. She wants to take steps to get over that stage fright. Building on her success in Hurricane Fluttershy and accounting for what Rainbow Dash did for Fluttershy in that episode, Fluttershy, driven by her natural kindness, wants to pay the favor back. Not only would she be fully aware of what the Equestria Games is even like, but there'd also be an in-character reason for her actually participating instead of it being out of complete nowhere. And again, we are never given a good explanation for why they're here to begin with. Yes, there is Thunderlane and there's other Pegasus that say that they can't only participate in one event, but you see all of these Pegasi in Hurricane Fluttershy and you just have to ask, what happened to all of them? Heck, later in the episode, Derpy Hooves is chosen as a Pegasus to replace Rainbow Dash. At least she can get herself reliably off the ground. Also, if Bulk Biceps sucks at flying, why is he participating in an event that he's bad at? The setup for this episode just feels so incredibly unnatural, and so little actually makes sense about it. And yet somehow it only gets worse and worse as it goes on. Like how the Wonderbolts try to manipulate Rainbow Dash to quitting on Ponyville's team to fly with Cloudsdale. And it's strange because after Wonderbolts Academy, Spitfire actually valued Rainbow Dash's integrity to her friends. Now she's villainized to trying to get her to rescind that very same integrity. I mean, this could make sense if there was any sign that this was a test by the Wonderbolts. After all, in a future episode, testing 1, 2, 3, there will be these things called the Wonderbolts Reserves opening up. But as of this episode, there's no sign of that. Not to mention that it makes absolutely zero sense for Rainbow Dash to be considered this offer, because the only reason she's even at Rainbow Falls is to get Ponyville to qualify. And what Twilight says to try and change her mind amounts to absolutely freaking nothing. Also, yeah, apples like Rarity and Pinkie Pie don't really amount to much of anything in this episode. Just some really dumb jokes if I'm being brutally honest. Like, Pinkie Pie just made it extremely jarring why Fluttershy is even here, and then there's Rarity who makes these outfits that look absolutely ridiculous. And in the back of my head I'm just thinking, wait, can't you make perfectly good costumes in the mysterious Ne'er-do-well? Like, that episode even had a scene where Fluttershy was flying as Ne'er-do-well. And they're still suited for success and freaking a Canterlot wedding to look at too. Why is Rarity suddenly bad at her job? I can't find any enjoyment in this episode. I honestly can't. It's not my most hated, probably for season 4, but not as a whole in the show. But it's definitely a nightmare episode. Let this be a lesson to please look over your script before you submit it as a final draft. I just find it incredible how an episode can have dialogue this absolutely stupid, and the story this dead on arrival, and no one really thinks to question it. Not gonna lie, I'm a little bit impressed. Episode 76, Three's a Crowd. Discord enlists Twilight for her help in conquering an illness. So as far as what I liked about this episode, well, Discord's a big part of it. I absolutely adore seeing Discord play at the main 6 in Cadence, though I'm also just a little bit iffy on how the main 6 are portrayed here. I guess just one way to look at it is that Discord tends to bring out the worst in every pony. I'd complain, but A, that kinda lines up with Return of Harmony, and B, it also makes Discord's motivation a lot more believable here too. I just find it really funny when Rarity, the element of generosity, isn't giving up her fainting couch, and everyone just looks at her funny like, this is your cue. Or how Rainbow Dash just ups and abandons literally every pony just because she did not want to deal with Discord at all. I also find it fascinating to know that Fluttershy and Discord are pen pals. So yeah, their relationship really isn't very one-sided after all. And I'm really happy about this because it kinda backs up what I said in Keep Coming Flutter On. Seeing Fluttershy give Discord the time of day does go to show that she's making an effort to really be friendly to him. The only part of this episode I don't like is Pinkie Pie. Like, her personality is especially dumbed down in this episode. The very beginning of this episode has her freak out over being excited over used patio furniture. which builds up to absolutely nothing. It's a complete one sequitur. Contrasting that to Fluttershy being excited about the Breezies, which at least is in line with her character because she's an animal lover. Also, she's distracted over freaking balloons. Question, why is Season 4 Pinkie Pie so juvenile? Like, in my opinion, she's already worst main 6, but this isn't helping her case. Anyway, I really like Discord's song, A Glass of Water. A lot of really creative visuals, and I absolutely adored when we get to see, like, Ricola featured in this episode. The pacing could have been better since the main conflict is only introduced, like, halfway through. But still, I found this episode very enjoyable, and I do want to call it a good episode. It's funny to think, by the way, how Twilight had to fly all the way to the ends of Equestria just for Discord. Which is an interesting way of calling out how she literally gave you absolutely no attention at all after you were reformed. At least outside of being scathingly negative towards you. Episode 77, Pinkie Pride. When Cheese Sandwich, a professional party pony, arrives in Ponyville, Pinkie competes with him to plan Rainbow Dash's birthday party. I really love this episode, guys. No joke, I can count the problems with this episode on one finger, and that only one problem is not a big problem. Let's start by saying that Pinkie Pie is at her absolute A game in this episode. I love her energy, I love her motivation, I love the gags she does at the goof off, I love just about everything about Pinkie Pie in this episode. And that's amazing because she's in the wrong here. Though I think a big part of that is just because of Cheese Sandwich and just how good of a foil he is to Pinkie Pie. There is nary a dull moment in this episode whatsoever. This episode is also a musical, which has much better pacing than, say, Magical Mystery Cure, which honestly felt like it went way too fast with all it had to explain. This episode just feels so much more organic, both in how much is said and how you're supposed to actually feel with the songs that are playing out. And yeah, I'm just gonna say it, even though I liked Magical Mystery Cure, this episode succeeded where that one failed. How I can feel during this episode actually lines up with the tone that this episode tried to get across. When Pinkie Pie is melancholy during her lament, I can actually feel how she feels. It's legitimately very moving, while Magical Mystery Cure only got me to feel any kind of emotion for it by the end of the episode, compared to, say, I Have to Find a Way, where I honestly started laughing during that moment. I also like how Pinkie Pie's friends are characterized in this episode. To be frank, when a new party pony is in town, it's very easy to be swept up in the excitement. And no one ever really outright forgets that Pinkie Pie was actually throwing her party either. Heck, if anything, Twilight even suggests that they both could have worked on the party together. And it's this moment right here that's extremely important as well. Twilight recognizes that Pinkie Pie is not in a very good mood, but instead of pressing her on it, she kinda just walks away, though she looks reluctant to. Which to me says that she knows something is up, but she's not gonna get to the bottom of it. It also saves this episode from running into a potential pitfall that was outlined in Party of One. You know, the episode where Pinkie Pie legitimately thought her friends hated her because they did not appreciate her parties? Big props for that. I also just really like the songs in this episode. There's not a single one I don't like. Either they do a lot to lift up your mood, they have really cool visuals, or both. In the case of Pinkie's Lament, by the way, best song of the episode hands down. I also just adore the callbacks to previous episodes from the picture frames she has on her wall. There's some really cool continuity nods there. And that triumphant note by the end of the song where Pinkie Pie is picking herself back up, dude, I was getting goosebumps from that moment. It's also another showcase of just how good the animation is in Season 4 of this show. I know some people may have a problem with how Cheese Sandwich is revealed to be inspired by Pinkie Pie, considering how prior he didn't really show it, but I don't really see that problem. And I say that because during the goof-off, he does sing the Smile song, which Pinkie Pie sung in A Friend Indeed. How could you not remember your inspiration if you remember one of the best songs they ever sung on the entire show? I mean, yeah, facial expressions don't say very much, but he's a professional, man. I imagine he's putting on a brave face for every other pony involved. I think it's also just really cool to see how involved Pinkie Pie is in every other pony's life, which is referenced in the very first song of the episode actually. Like how Pinkie Pie planned Diamond Tiara's quinceañera and the cake's baby shower, though no mention of Sweet and Elite. Interesting. There's just one thing about this episode I don't like, and that's how Pinkie Pie at the end of the episode says that she never got Cheese Sandwich's name. You know, the very same pony that repeatedly would say his name throughout songs, and the name that she herself even said when she forfeited the goof-off and declared him the winner. I feel like this is referencing something that I don't even know what it is. Also, you'd think you know the person's name who tried to drive you out of Ponyville. At least in your head anyway. But that aside, this episode was awesome. And it being a key episode means we'll have to remember this episode for later, which I am totally looking forward to. Episode 78, Simple Ways. I might even trying. Rarity is jealous when Applejack inadvertently steals her crush. It's a story about a love triangle. Rarity loves this pony called Trenderhoof, and Trenderhoof loves Applejack. Cue jealousy. I guess I'll be up in front and say when I first watched this episode, I didn't like it very much. I guess this is the first time we see Rarity be boy crazy, and Trenderhoof does look like the kind of pony that she would swoon over, but man, I did not like Rarity in this episode. I'll just throw this out there. Rarity is in general very professional when it comes to presenting herself in front of others. Yes, she can get angry and upset, but she's in general very poised. I get that this is kind of new territory for her character, but it's also not. I get that it's hyperbolic that Rarity says that she's had a crush on Trenderhoof since the beginning of time, but what about Prince Blueblood? Didn't you have a crush on him too? You did say you wanted to be a princess, right? So how long could she really have had this crush on Trenderhoof if she was pining for Prince Blueblood as early as the Ticketmaster? I also in general just do not like how irresponsible she is in this episode. She's constantly being reminded at the Ponyville Festival, but all the same, it's like she doesn't even care. I probably would not mind as much if we saw her working at the festival as she was still being really jealous, but the more she saw Trenderhoof and Applejack interacting with each other, the more jealous she became before she just could not take it anymore. It doesn't help that Rarity is also really dumbed down in this episode. I get that she's posh, but she does know how a harness works. It wouldn't be the first time she did manual labor. If she were to try and emulate Applejack the way that she normally does her work, but let's say she was just really bad at it, I think that'd be a lot funnier. In fact, that's what I thought they were going for too when Applejack was talking about bucking trees the right way. Like, this episode sets itself up to make a fool out of Rarity, but before near the end where she goes full on country folk, it feels like they just did not go very far at all with that direction. Admittedly, when she's wearing overalls and she's talking like, I have droopy drawers, yeah, the dialogue does become a lot funnier, but before that, it's just painful. Having said that, there are things about this episode I do like. Applejack in general is my favorite part of this episode. I love seeing how she bounces off of Trenderhoof, and she plays off of Rarity extremely well. Like, she's by far the most entertaining part of this episode. I also really like the moral and how it's about being true to yourself. All in all, this episode is in a similar camp to Her Swarming Eve for me. Not bad, but really a weak episode all around. But if I had to choose between okay and nightmare episode, I honestly just cannot shake this feeling, but this is a nightmare episode! Now, even though I think this episode is bad, I can't see why people like it. Especially for Applejack, but for me, I'm not feeling it. Episode 79, Filli Vanilli. When Big Mac gets a little hoarse, Fluttershy secretly helps him lip sync. Oh boy, this one will be fun. So, it's no secret that Fluttershy is probably my favorite main 6 character. And if not her, it's Twilight. So, yeah, it's Fluttershy. I just find her timidness so relatable, and also just seeing how she's making progress incrementally, just trying to become more and more bold as time goes on. It's honestly inspiring, and this is probably one of my favorite episodes off of that principle alone. Yeah, I actually really like this episode. The story here is that Big Mac is basically performing a cappella for this band called the Ponytones, and when he gets a little hoarse, yes, that pun was intentional, Fluttershy, after some mild persuasion, does actually take the part in performing for him. But she's doing it covertly because, well, the girl has stage fright, which has been established in previous episodes. It's just that here, it's been given a more affirmative confirmation. And as it turns out, yeah, Fluttershy really loves to sing. It's just doing it in front of others that she's a little iffy on. You could argue it's weird that her friends don't know that she can sing so well, but here's the thing. There were not very many chances that her friends would be able to hear her and just her singing alone. Like, you have Her Swarming Eve, which basically has her harmonizing with her friends. May the Best Fight Win was a duet with only Rainbow Dash being nearby, and she was of course singing too. And then there's the Ticketmaster, which is minor, but it exists, so there you go. Even then, Twilight was not in the mood. This episode also just has some really neat callbacks. The Poison Joke from Battle Gossip, you see Cranky Doodle Donkey and Matilda appear from A Friend Indeed. Even small stuff like Shirley fainting over Big Macintosh like in Hearts and Hooves Day where they were actually smitten with each other. Also the back and forth between Applejack and Big Macintosh. It's freaking hilarious. Something about the deadpan delivery on Applejack's questions and just the animation being so static. Though in reality, all of Fluttershy's friends here have a chance to shine. Pinkie Pie winning that turkey call competition. Rarity as a whole is just fantastic in her portrayal in this episode. And dare I say it, I freaking just love Fluttershy here. I love how upbeat and happy she is just doing her thing. I do have one question though for Zakura. So, you can fix a broken tooth in mere seconds like it's nothing, but you can't do the same thing for Big Mac's laryngitis. That is insanely suspect. But it could be worse. At least it's not something like, say, Big Mac's hair that can't be fixed, but that's a story for another episode. I guess we can talk about the elephant in the room, of course, and that's Pinkie Pie's characterization. This is something I noticed, but people really hate Pinkie Pie in this episode. Which, all I can really say is, welcome to the club, man. I've hated Pinkie Pie since season 1. Though, unlike Green Isn't Your Color, this is not enough to make me think this is not a good episode. And there's multiple reasons behind that. One, the rest of this episode is basically stone perfect. Even if Pinkie Pie is absolutely terrible here, every other character is pulling their weight and then some. Especially Rarity. Like, no joke, Rarity in this episode reminds me of Rainbow Dash and Hurricane Fluttershy. That's a good thing. And you have to remember her point also, how it was Fluttershy that wanted to keep singing and keep up the facade. Which leads beautifully to the moral about how it was Fluttershy herself holding herself back. And the second is because in Green Isn't Your Color, I feel like Pinkie Pie was actively cannibalizing the moral in that episode. This episode's moral and message still holds up even with Pinkie Pie being so obnoxious. Besides, you can argue that Pinkie Pie is in character in this episode. Though I would like to forget it, Pinkie Pie has been demonstrated to be very quick to action and slow to really think it through. Though I say argue because you could also say that she should know Fluttershy better. Whether or not she is in character though, I do think she could have been used better here. Like, her verbal assault near the beginning of the episode is just really weird. Like, in what way, shape, or form is that supposed to make Fluttershy feel better about singing? Even if it's in character for Pinkie Pie, it's not fun for the audience to see at all. For the element of laughter, she sure is an act for making people miserable. Yeah, I don't like bullies, and Pinkie Pie is nothing short of a bully in this episode. Especially in the end, it's like watching someone pour salt in an open wound. No matter your stance though, we better at least agree on this. The writer did not deserve death threats for how she wrote Pinkie Pie in this episode. That's just juvenile. Like, if this is gonna push people over the edge, but not Dragon Quest, then people really need to get their priorities in order. Episode 80. Twilight Time. The Cutie Mark Crusaders leverage their time with Twilight to become popular with their schoolmates. There's a lot about this episode that I really like, but let's start with this, because this is really big. Twilight being a princess is actually being addressed in the show now. And no, I'm not counting 3 as a crowd. But really, I just find the story of this episode to be very interesting, and seeing just how these kids react so strongly to Twilight being a princess. And it's mildly interesting also to see the CMC, or specifically Sweetie Belle, trying to leverage that. Even being able to wrap Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon around their hooves. And then it's just escalating up and more as we see more of the kids wanting a piece of Twilight, and seeing the CMC just revel in the adulation they receive from their fellow classmates. And yeah, I can believe this. It's only natural to want to be accepted by your fellow classmates in school. And having something over Diamond Tiara can be tempting for literally anybody. After all, she's practically cheating at life. I also just find it interesting how Twilight reacts to this. She's portrayed as very amiable and humble, even when the entire school shows up at her library. Even towards the CMC, and the only reason the CMC lose at the end is simply because they saw their friendship with Twilight as a commodity and not something truly special. Which, yeah, it's a great moral. There could be some very important people you know in life, but it's important to know, of course, that your friendship with them should be based on like who they are as a person and not what they are. Diamond Tiara also gets some cool moments, like those acrobatics that her butler was doing just for her to steal the show. It's just a really fun way to set up the CMC being angry at her. The bit where we see Sweetie Belle fantasize over flying Diamond Tiara like she's some kind of pizza was also really funny to me. All around, this episode is full of really fun moments. Like near the beginning where Apple Bloom manages to give a plant life and it starts coughing up a fit. Or even just little stuff like Twilight especially eating when the kids are trying to take pictures of her. But yeah, the story is cute, the humor lands, and the episode, it's good. Though I can't help but wonder just how bad really is Apple Bloom at making potions. I get that she's mainly just improving her abilities, but I don't know. In the Cutie Pox, she seemed to be able to do it just fine. Episode 81. It ain't easy being Breezies. When the Breezies' journey back home goes awry, Fluttershy takes care of them. With this, we have finally reached Fluttershy's key episode, which was foreshadowed as early as Three's a Crowd, believe it or not. That episode had Fluttershy observing the Breezies when she went off on her own, and here we see her actually interacting with the Breezies. So there's a lot about this episode I really like. The morals are simply fantastic. The first one we hear about, of course, being that you can't be right with the words you say, but wrong at the top of your voice, which is communicated well by just how abrasive Seabreeze is towards his fellow Breezies. And Fluttershy learns an incredibly important moral for her character, namely that sometimes you have to be mean to be kind. Whether it's to protect those you love, or it's to actually help people get on the right track. That's called tough love. And yes, it is love. It's made very clear here in this episode that Fluttershy really enjoyed being with the Breezies, and her teary-eyed goodbye will show that she will very much miss them. It's an all-around very solid story, but I'm not quite sure I'd call this episode good still. There's a few minor issues I have, like how the episode opens with Fluttershy saying, "as you know," and then talking about the Breezies making their way back home. And like, it's not the first time this show led an episode with that line. It happened in Castlemania too, but I excuse that line being said in that episode because that was Princess Celestia giving Twilight a hint on where to look. Yes, she knows about the castle of the two sisters, but she did not think to check there. In this episode, everyone already knows this information, so Fluttershy is only saying this for us, the audience, which is not very organic for the story. But that there is just a small problem. My big problems come more towards how the Breezies interact with Fluttershy and the ending. Like, I understand Fluttershy is trying to show kindness, but it comes off as very naive. One scene, she's worried about their health because they're acting like they have colds and stuff, and the next scene, they're having a dance party. I get that the point is that the Breezies are taking advantage of her hospitality, but I feel like the scene would have been improved if we saw more of Fluttershy's friends intervene. I understand why Applejack didn't. After Applebuck season, she would have to learn to respect Fluttershy's authority and animals more. But what about Rainbow Dash? She shows up while Fluttershy is having a party with the Breezies, and she's not questioning them at all. I just think a line or two from her would go a long way in correcting Fluttershy's thinking, other than having Seabreeze destroy someone's saxophone. And then there's the ending, where Twilight can just transmutate the main 6 into Breezies and help the Breezies make their way back home. Which is not only a Deus Ex Machina, but it's also kind of a stretch to think that the main 6 alone would be enough to help the Breezies get back home. Like, something I'm wondering is, I know you need the Breeze to keep the pollen safe, but can't you have them like hitch a ride on any of the other Picassi? And just keep the Breeze going so that their pollen still stays good? If so, that'd make a lot more sense, and honestly, it'd be a lot more believable that it actually would work. That being said, even though I have all these issues with this episode, I overall just found it very enjoyable. While the story structure and the writing may be just only able to get an okay rating from me, the morals presented and the overall emotion felt from the characters in this episode just barely pushes it over good. I know I'm stretching it, but I just really like this episode all the same. But if you thought this episode was okay or worse, well, I wouldn't blame you. Episode 82, Somepony to watch over me. Applejack becomes paranoid over Applebloom's safety. I'll start this review off by being nice. I'm happy that at the very least, they did not go with a cliche plot like, say, Applebloom wanted to host a party at her house and had to keep it a secret from her family. As a matter of fact, this story to my knowledge is actually pretty original, which unfortunately could also be why this episode has so many problems with it. Like how Applejack for some reason believes that Applebloom is literally neurologically disabled and cannot think for herself. And as a result of this, she becomes ridiculously clingy towards Applebloom, where it almost feels obsessive. Scratch that, it feels very excessive. And all of this over just one little mistake that Applebloom makes when she startled off the table. And it's because of this mistake that Applejack is gonna forgo the delivery she's gonna be making towards this far off place, claiming family's more important than pies. It makes her come off as very irresponsible, especially when you consider the fact that it's confirmed as early as a cancel-out wedding that foal sitters exist. Barring that, later in the episode, when Applejack realized that she was getting duped by Applebloom and her friends, the Kingdom Crusaders, she gets Rarity to foal sit for her. If the solution to keeping Applebloom unsupervised was so simple, why would that not be the first thing you think of? Also remember, as early as bridal gossip, Applebloom has demonstrated she can travel through the Everfree Forest on her own. And Applejack is aware of at least one of these instances. So you trust your little sister of visiting Zecora every now and then through the Everfree Forest, but not your own house. Yes, I am aware that Applejack's parents are in fact deceased, so it's very likely that Applejack is playing the part of a very overprotective mom. But that excuse only goes so far. It can explain why she feels out of character in this episode, but not her bad judgment. I'm not going to say that Applejack should have been toned down because that'd be kind of hypocritical after Lesson 0. As a matter of fact, I'm almost certain that's what the writer was going for. I think my problem here is with the progression. In Lesson 0, Twilight slowly but surely becomes more and more insane as time goes on. But in this episode, Applejack goes from 0 to 100 almost immediately. And as a result, instead of making me think that she's just very overprotective of Applebloom, It makes her look like she does not respect her as a functional being. This all is leading up to an episode that's already really bad, but then we get to the climax and the ending. Even if the story is bad, I'm more forgiving of a bad episode if it at least has a good moral at the end of it all. But the ending is a complete catastrophe. As I said earlier, Apple Bloom's way of trying to get Applejack to trust her is to basically wander on her own through a fiery swamp, completely unsupervised, to make the pie delivery, which in reality should backfire and actually put Applejack in the right. Yes, the scene with the fire swamp is cool and the camera has an interesting design, but this all reinforces my point that Applejack is actually in the right now for trying to be protective over Apple Bloom. And it's a shame because it feels like the writer has something going with this chimera. Like the tiger part and Apple Bloom can actually relate over having an overbearing sister watching over you. But this goes absolutely nowhere and just feels like it's a very half-hearted way of saying that Applejack was actually in the wrong all the same. But after Apple Bloom wanders away from home and almost dies to this freaking thing, she reveals the pies are safe, and only now does Applejack accept the idea that Apple Bloom can be trusted on her own. Forgive me, but I have to take the time right now to explain why this nightmare episode's ending is so bad. Earlier in the episode, Apple Bloom was effectively being punished by being obedient to her family. She did all of her chores, she did nothing rebellious, and the entire time after just one little mistake, she can't escape Applejack hovering over her until blatantly disregarding her own safety and the wishes of Applejack, and she only regains her independence by disobeying Applejack, putting forth the moral that being rebellious is actually better than being obedient because that gives you privileges. I get that the actual moral was about how Applejack had to stop being so obsessive over Apple Bloom's safety. However, in this episode, it was only by not following that moral that she saved her life. It is not communicated properly at all. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of a dog and pony show, but that episode did us moral justice. It was nice that Rarity's friends were there for her, but she managed to save herself. Apple Bloom would have been dead if not for Applejack. And it doesn't help that Applejack suffers no consequences for anything, even though by her own admission, it's her fault that Apple Bloom was driven to do what she did. No, the only pony to get punished here is Apple Bloom. Applejack sheepishly calls attention to the fact that it is her at fault for some of it, but it's very slight, and Applejack has a tendency to go really hard on herself. So here, once again, it just feels half-hearted. It's quite a shame because this episode had a lot of really good ideas, but when all was said and done, I felt frustrated, and that's about all I can really say for this episode. Episode 83, Maud Pie. Pinkie Pie's friends try to befriend her sister. First thing to note is that this episode introduces a new character, and that's Pinkie Pie's sister, Maud Pie. She's very interested in rocks, and that makes it very hard for Pinkie Pie's friends to really bond with her. I have a lot to say about this episode, but let me get the one thing I think is bad out of the way first. So you know how Rarity's cutie marker reflects her ability to hunt for gems, right? Gems are a type of rock. You think it's weird that Rarity and Maud can't bond over stuff like rubies and emeralds? That's really my one and only complaint with this episode. Everything else, though, is pretty dang rock solid. This episode is actually really freaking funny, and a lot of it just has to do with Maud as a character. I love the deadpan delivery on all of her lines in this episode, and how it's just established that she doesn't really show her emotions very well in the same way Pinkie Pie does. It's also interesting to see the kind of character that Maud is, considering how different she is from Pinkie Pie. Her speech is more slow and monotone, and her personality is a lot more reserved. At one point in this episode, I was wondering just how these two clicked so well with each other. Though, looking back on the Crystal Empire, Pinkie Pie does seem to like ponies with dry personalities, so it kinda makes sense as you think about that. On the note of Pinkie Pie though, this has to be one of her best appearances in this season. It's really funny to see how she bounces off of Maud, and the way she acts in this episode is entirely in character for her as well. Like, her biggest motivation in this episode is just seeing her friends and Maud get along, which brings me to Pinkie Pie's friends actually. I really like the approach they tried taking when it comes to Maud and trying to befriend her. They realized her start was, well, for lack of a better word, rocky, and tried to befriend her one pony at a time. Which, if nothing else, I appreciate that this episode is taking the time to really give these characters a chance to really try before they give up. It's also through these attempts at trying to befriend Maud where I think this episode gets across a really mature moral. Maybe it was not the writer's intention, but I do like how this episode tries to be realistic in showing that you can't befriend everyone. Yes, by the end of the episode, they do realize they can befriend Maud over their mutual love for Pinkie Pie, but that's just it. Pinkie Pie also learned a very important lesson from this episode. And dare I say it, this episode succeeded where a friend indeed failed. Maybe it is counterproductive to the show's focus to teach that you cannot befriend everyone. But I do appreciate that Pinkie Pie did learn that you can't expect everyone to be buddy-buddy with others just because you really want it to happen. That's a very important lesson for her to learn. And even then, this episode has a very sweet ending. And good thing too, because Pinkie Pie takes it very hard to see others not be happy. Y'all know by now, this is a good episode. And I know Mod is not interested in winning, but after seeing Mod throw that boulder as hard as she did, I would love to see who win in an Iron Pony competition. Episode 84, For Whom the Sweetie Belle Toils. Sweetie Belle is frustrated over feeling she lives in Rarity's shadow. I think this episode, better than any other, demonstrates just what kind of character Sweetie Belle is. She aspires to differentiate herself from her sister Rarity, and her aspirations have a lot to do with the CMC as a whole. It's very clearly demonstrated just seeing how hard she worked on this play, and how she wanted to have this play be good on her own merits. So when it turns out that no one can remember anything from the play except for the costumes, which Rarity made, she gets upset. It's interesting to note also that Sweetie Belle's inability to make convincing set pieces does carry over from the showstoppers. I think what hit closest to home for me though is just how everyone seems to be able to only recall the dresses that were made for the play, but not anything else to do with the play itself. And just seeing how much it burned Sweetie Belle up inside, and the resentment she holds towards Rarity also for past events. In this episode's case, her 5th birthday party. It just brings to mind some very strong feelings of jealousy over feeling that maybe she just cannot measure up to Rarity no matter what she tries. I can't really relate to Sweetie Belle's feelings here though, because well, A, I'm the firstborn of my family, and B, I typically don't get jealous either, but I can completely empathize with the idea that you want to show your talents first and foremost and no one acknowledges them. That just hits very close to home for me. And it's nice to see Princess Luna return, for another dream episode I guess, and showing Sweetie Belle that her jealousy is actually ill-founded. This episode also goes to pretty good lengths to show just how much Rarity really cares for Sweetie Belle and her happiness. From touching up her dresses, to just how she tried to save her birthday party, even giving her proper credit for the idea of the streamers, she really does care. Which really just makes it so sad to think that Sweetie Belle would try to sabotage one of Rarity's headpieces. Which, interestingly enough, would actually ruin her entire livelihood. Like, just imagine the guilt and shame that would result from knowing that you single-handedly ruined your older sibling's life. And it's also that very same scene that gives you a very legitimate reason to be afraid of Princess Luna, because when you really think about it, she really just read Sweetie Belle's mind, and the minds of other ponies, specifically to teach her a lesson about being full of herself. Now more than anything else, I want to know the extent of Princess Luna's powers. And speaking of Princess Luna, I think it's interesting just seeing the parallels between Princess Luna and Sweetie Belle. Just like Sweetie Belle lives in Rarity's shadow, you can see Princess Luna lives in Princess Celestia's shadow too. And as Nightmare Moon, she did a lot of emotional and physical damage to Princess Celestia. Just like how in this episode, Sweetie Belle almost ruined Rarity's whole life. It's a good episode, you already know that. And you also have to appreciate the parallels between Rarity and Sweetie Belle here too. Sweetie Belle has her play, Rarity has her order for Sapphire Shores. Both are also extremely paranoid that their offerings are received well. And heck, both even like being the center of attention. All in all, a fascinating character study in Sweetie Belle with a very sweet ending. Episode 85, Leap of Faith. Applejack is pressured into embellishing a phony cure-all tonic. And so we arrive at the last key episode of the main 6. And it's with Applejack. I guess I'll start with the stuff I liked about this episode first. For starters, this episode features the Flim Flam brothers. I like these characters a lot. Their charisma, their street smarts, the way they talk, and their music. It's just really fun. I also just really like the conflict and the moral that's presented. Sometimes a white lie would seem like the best way to go, but in reality, they can have very dire consequences when they start piling up. Granted, I don't think Applejack necessarily had to learn this moral, especially when A, she's lied before in the past, and B, she's told lies specifically to the populace of Ponyville, but it's all the same a good moral, even if Applejack had to have her character bent to teach it. With that all said, outside the Flim Flam brothers, I cannot say I was invested in this episode. You may find my points petty, but I don't think they are. Let's start with the pony that's in cahoots with the Flim Flam brothers. He's in this episode to help the Flim Flam brothers push their product, and he comes on stage with these crutches and these glasses. It makes you just think that, you know, he drinks his tonic and he'll be able to walk just fine. And that's all fine and good, but something that distracted me was that he was wearing glasses. I know they don't outright say that this tonic can clear eyesight, but you think that for something called a hero tonic, it'd be able to heal you entirely, not just parts of your body, but your entire body. It just doesn't come as convincing when you can see that there are still parts of the body that are not quite all well. Now, I wouldn't complain if he actually needed the glasses, but near the end of the episode, he backs up Applejack in saying that the tonic is a phony. And as he does it, he takes off his glasses. Why? I can only assume because he doesn't need them. Like, why would you do that? All that really does is take away even more credibility from the Flynn brothers, who are already supposed to be established before this episode as being credible. I mean, yes, Granny Smith does still fall for it, but there's actually a more legitimate reason behind that. In the Super Speedy Cider Sweet 6000, she does try their cider, and she does think it tastes pretty good. It's subtle, but it's enough to communicate the fact that she does have a reason to believe they are of quality. But still, if you're gonna put on a performance, go all the way with it. That aside, I'll be honest, I was just really bored throughout this episode. I could see the attempts at jokes at the beginning of the episode, and the Flynn brothers are always a treat to watch, but when they're not on stage, it's just bleh. On the bright side, it made the highlight pretty dang easy to spot. Because yeah, if you watch this episode for anything, it'll be the moral. Which not only is an absolutely fantastic moral, but its delivery is also exceptionally well handled. Applejack had to admit that she told a lie to tell the truth, which for her could get in the way of her pride a lot. It also helped that the reveal that the tonic was a phony was revealed not even halfway through the episode. If the truth came out only like say near the end of the episode and Applejack was realizing this along with everyone else, it otherwise could have been very easy for this episode to confuse its moral with just making sure you actually do your research before you believe something. And it also does help seeing Apple Bloom and Granny Smith playing with each other in the water, where Applejack is really questioning whether or not the truth is really worth it. All in all, the humor is really light, and it wasn't really very entertaining for me, honestly. But the story itself is very sound, and the writer, to his credit, did an excellent job delivering the moral. So by no stretch can I call this a nightmare episode. I want to call it a good episode, but I just cannot find it in me to do it. Yeah, this episode is just okay. As good as the moral on its own is not enough to sustain an episode being rewatchable or even worth watching to begin with. And with how dull this episode feels, at least to me, that's not a good thing. Easily my least favorite Key episode as well. Though don't be confused, it's my least favorite because Rainbow Falls sucks so badly that I actually hate that episode. Episode 86, testing 1, 2, 3. Rainbow Dash gets help to study for an upcoming exam. This is an interesting one. Mostly for the moral at the end of this episode, basically in how people can learn different ways and there's no one way to teach. In some way it's kind of inspirational. But the story, Rainbow Dash wants to become a Wonderbolt's reserve, so she has to pass this test. The problem is that she knows little to nothing about the Wonderbolt's history and she has a hard time actually studying this. Even then, all of her friends do know the history of the Wonderbolts and they try to teach her. I imagine some may be confused by the fact that the main 6 do know about the history of the Wonderbolts but not Rainbow Dash, but A, it's established in this episode that Rainbow Dash was a poor student. And even previous episodes reference how she's a dropout in some schools. And B, the main 6 did go to school, so obviously they should have been able to pick up on this at least in some point in time. It's just that Fluttershy, Rarity, Applejack, and Pinkie Pie were able to pick up on it better because either they were able to adapt to what they were being taught, or they were just taught in ways that would make it easy for them to understand. Working with your hands is a very legitimate way of learning, and so is listening through music and rap. I know this because when I went to school, those were actual methods that were used to teach. And additional fun fact, the classes that allowed those options were the ones I did the best in. Yeah, this episode is kind of personal to me. All too often it happens that you try to be taught in school, but the way you're being taught is not going to work with how you learn. And I really appreciate that this episode is bringing attention to that fact. Though I'm not necessarily sure how applicable it would be in school because, well, schools just don't do that. They don't conform to one student's method of learning. But Rainbow Dash was effectively homeschooled here, so it makes sense for this episode. I also found the antics in this episode to be really funny overall. From Rainbow Dash's little rocking band while Twilight's giving her lecture to Pinkie Pie's rap, there's quite a few good jokes. Also, Fluttershy when she's dressed up as Princess Celestia is freaking adorable, as if my heart wasn't already melted enough. Of course, it's a good episode. Oh, and one more thing. If anyone has actually made fan art of Twilight as a Wonderbolt, please let me know, I'd love to see it. Episode 87, Trade Ya? The main 6 go to a traders convention in Rainbow Falls. Let the record show that I think the location of Rainbow Falls is cursed. This place is where logic goes to die. The story here is that the main six, because Princess Twilight's needed here, are going to a traders convention in Rainbow Falls. Rainbow Dash was a first edition book. Applejack and Rarity are pulling their stuff together, just in case there's something either of them really want but they can't afford on their own. And Twilight's trying to get rid of books she has no room for in her library anymore. I should also mention that Fluttershy is tagging along with Rainbow Dash and Pinkie Pie with Twilight. Starting off, this episode has a very clunky start to it. Pinkie Pie and Twilight just say what the main six already know. Like, was it too hard to have a guard just say, "Welcome to Rainbow Falls for the Traders Convention," and then have an extremely excited Pinkie Pie brag about how Twilight's gonna be here on royal duty? Like, there has to be a more natural way of getting that information across. But that's just the intro, we still have the whole episode to go. To start, we'll talk about Applejack and Rarity. They both find something they really want, and they're trying to work out who actually gets what they want. To be honest, this is probably the best part of the episode. And that's saying something because it reminds me a lot of Look Before You Sleep. But since they're both in the background and it's really only there for like transitions, it just feels a lot funnier. Applejack wants this really rusty pie tin, which I just thought was, why would she want that? And Rarity wants this brooch, which is like slightly older than the one she already has on her, but it looks identical. Though Rarity can't see the difference between the two. It's mildly funny and enjoyable enough on its own. For what it's worth, it gets a pass. Next, let's talk about Twilight and Pinkie Pie's moments here. Twilight has a lot of books that she's trying to get rid of, and Pinkie Pie wants to help her get rid of the books, but only in a way that'd be really fair for her. And you know what? Fair enough. Pinkie Pie has bartered with other ponies before, and seeing her embellish Twilight's books can be pretty fun to watch too. Though she does go too far and ends up making every other pony just walk away because they figure they can't really afford what Twilight has. And by the end of it all, Twilight just keeps her books on her, and I guess she doesn't want to trade them anymore. Despite the fact that she came here not just on royal duty, but also to get rid of some books that she can't really afford to hold in her library anymore. Also, she calls back the Spike at your service. Why Spike at your service of all freaking episodes? Ultimately though, outside of Pinkie Pie, I found Twilight's moments to be pretty underwhelming. Spike's also here, he's trying to trade in one of his comic books for another one, but he exists solely in the background without ever having any focus in any shot of this episode. It's fun to see him around, but that's really it. But then we get to Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy, and these two are the real meat of this episode. What Rainbow Dash wants is a first edition book of the first Daring Do book. And Fluttershy wants to trade in her bear call for hopefully a bird whistle. The object that Rainbow Dash wants to trade in for that freaking book? A rusty old horseshoe. If nothing else, that's actually pretty funny. But predictably, the pony with the trade that she wants to make does not want that horseshoe. What she wants is an Orthros. A very angry looking Orthros. And so for these two, they're effectively going on a fetch quest, getting items to trade for other items to get that book eventually. And on that quest, there were lots of hang-ups. Like how this pony that's apparently disabled wants to go get something to eat, and he leaves his stall immediately after Fluttershy asks what kind of like porcelain chicken he wanted. Which really just makes me wonder why you would leave immediately after hearing these ponies want to make a trade with you later on. But I'll give the writer the benefit of the doubt. Maybe the pony just was not really thinking they'd be getting that trade back in time. That's something I can generally overlook. What I can't overlook though, is forgetting one of the main features of your characters. Once Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy get the Orthros, they try to make their way back to get that Daring Do book. And Rainbow Dash has a really hard time getting around these ponies in her way. Oh, I don't know, Rainbow. Man, it sure would be nice if you could just, I don't know, fly over them? Nothing was stopping you earlier in the episode from flying, so why can you not fly now? I wouldn't complain if there were ponies directly above them too that they were flying and she couldn't get around those either, but there weren't. You could very easily have just flown over the ponies and then tell the pony with the book you want that you have her Orthros and you need some time to get it to her. And on top of that, you see her packing her stuff up and ready to leave. Why would you not think of that? Like, in Feeling Pinkie Keen, I can understand why Twilight does not think to either levitate Spike out of the bog or teleport over the pit. It's been well demonstrated that magic takes concentration, so she couldn't really think to do that in time. Same story with putting her hoof down. The point of Fluttershy not flying over the bridge was that she was not letting herself be pushed around. And speaking of being pushed around, Fluttershy regressed hard. Like, really hard. I understand it's a hard process to learn to stand up for yourself more, but you think she'd put up more of a fight when it came down to being traded in exchange for a freaking book. Especially when back at home, your profession is an animal caretaker. Without you, those animals are going to starve. Just this freaking once stand up for yourself, Fluttershy. By the way, the pony that wanted the Orthros at first was like, she wanted it when it was like angry and fighting its trainer, but when it's happy and tame, she calls it crazy. I lashed out at Rainbow Dash over selling Fluttershy into slavery, but she very clearly was unaware of the trade that she just made and how she screwed up. As evidenced by both how she was trying to tell Fluttershy about how she finally got the book, and how after realizing what she just did, she immediately seeks out Twilight's help to reverse the trade. Even ignoring that moment, this was a nightmare episode! Though in all honesty, this is probably the closest to a guilty pleasure I'll find in Season 4. It still made the best pet win, but it's a lot closer to okay than that episode too. I guess if it's any consolation, Fluttershy did at least get her bird whistle by the end of the episode, but that's a hollow victory. Episode 88, Inspiration Manifestation. Spike enchants Rarity with a book that heightens her inspiration. What happens is that after this puppeteer bashes Rarity's work and says that it's just crap, Spike takes it upon himself to try and cheer Rarity up by finding her something to inspire her to make better products. Something I have to give this episode huge props for is that this Spike is phenomenal. I really like how he's portrayed in this episode. Think Lesson 0 Spike, but he's the main character. And as such, he has to learn the moral by the end of the episode. And the moral he learns is fantastic. There's a difference between being supportive and just enabling bad behavior. And the fact that Spike learns this moral from having to not simp for Rarity for once, it's showing that he's finally growing out of just this completely blind love for her. Spike is finally taking the steps to become his own person, and I love it. I also just like how the conflict is portrayed in this episode. At first, Rarity's inspiration started off pretty mild and, beneficial, but before too long, it gets out of hand. There were some good silly moments like giving Rainbow Dash a dress while she's clearing clouds, or changing the theme of this fool's birthday party into being basically just this really fancy one which none of the kids will like. And then it gets scary, like how she can apparently just trap ponies in a gazebo, or turn the dirt into solid gold. And the more of this that Spike sees, the more unsure he really is if this is the right thing for her to be doing. And when he finally stands up to Rarity and tells her enough is enough, just mwah. French kiss. On the note of the gazebo, by the way, this I think is the first time we've seen any pony use a spell that can make ponies phase through walls. Outside of the babies. I don't want to count that. Though speaking of babies, you know how the Ponyville fair is called the Foal in Filli Fair? Isn't the foal just a young pony? Why isn't it the colt in Filli Fair? If I had any complaints, it's just the fact that Spike constantly is told to tell the truth to Rarity, and it gets kinda repetitive. Also, Spike's little remark back at Twilight after she had to fix all that dark magic in Ponyville, I kinda wish he did not make that snide comment towards Twilight. It just serves to make Spike sound very insensitive. At its core though, this is a good episode, and I can really only hope that the next Spike episode is as good as this one, if not better. Episode 89, Equestria Games. Spike endeavors to be worth his newfound reputation in the Crystal Empire. So after this Equestria Games arc that spanned since Season 3, and then led us way through multiple episodes in Season 4, some good, some terrible, we finally arrive at the games themselves. And it's another Spike episode. Immediately after a Spike episode. Yep, all this tension, all this hype, and all this build-up for a Spike episode. Honestly, I should be mad, because this feels like clickbait. But after the blunder that was Rainbow Falls, I'm kinda glad this is a Spike episode. Because when you really think about it, we already saw the Equestria Games in Rainbow Falls. In any case, the story is about how Spike wants to be worth the admiration of the Crystal Empire. Yeah, it turns out this once lost empire now sees Spike as some kind of hero. It's about time Spike got some respect. Unfortunately for Spike, he's a baby dragon in a massive coliseum full of people, and that's kinda getting under his skin. Yeah, the poor guy suffers from some hardcore stage fright, like Fluttershy level hardcore. And who can really blame him? There's thousands of ponies up in the stadium. Thousands of ponies, mind you, that see Spike, that look up to, and practically worship Spike. That is some abyssal level pressure to be placed on anyone, especially a baby dragon. And no matter how hard Spike tries, he keeps cracking under the pressure. At least with lighting the torch, he had Twilight's help. When it came down though to singing the Cloudzone National Anthem, my god. You're probably gonna think I'm a terrible person, but I actually found this really funny. And the reason why is because it's just so brutally true and relatable for me. I talked about this during my Season 2 reviewed video, but it's actually something that had happened to me before. And dear lord is it humiliating. Not only is Spike's ad-libbing really funny, but we also get to see the faces of the ponies reacting to it. And it is gloriously cringy. Don't get me wrong, I felt bad for Spike. Really freaking bad. But I have to give the writer credit. He knows how to make a fella laugh. After a blunder like that, you feel like you've done something unforgivable. You just cannot look past it. The humiliation just eats away at you. And it ties beautifully into the moral, where after Spike did something fantastical and saved a bunch of ponies from this massive iceberg, he just shrugs it off like it was nothing special. even though every other pony is just absolutely amazed at what he managed to do. On the note of this scene, by the way, it's rather impressive how the writer managed to make this a situation where no one else could do this but Spike. Thanks to Twilight's interference earlier in the episode, they had to tighten up security, and so only the Pinkie and, well, Spike could do anything about it. Though it begs one question. I understand why the unicorns can't use their magic because they're no one really special, not even Rarity. But what about the alicorns? Were they not allowed to use their magic either? At the very least, I kind of expected Twilight to help Spike approach the iceberg so that he could melt it. But I can look past this, because 1, this moment was freaking awesome, and 2, it's just really good to see an episode remember that Spike's the dragon and that he can use his fire breath for once. And then there's the moral. And if this episode was not already good, this moral would push it to great. All the praise in the world will not do you any good if you don't feel proud of yourself. Yes, Spike may have felt like he did a lot of bad throughout the entire event, but you gotta forgive yourself and keep moving forward. There's a difference between being modest and then being self-dismissive. I might be a bit biased because, well, as a content creator, this moral tends to hit a lot harder, but that does not hurt its excellent delivery and the fantastic episode to go along with it. This Spike episode blew every other episode featuring Spike out of the water. And if we get more Spike episodes like this in the future, I'm gonna be a happy camper. Episodes 90 and 91, Twilight's Kingdom. Twilight questions her role as a princess, feeling as if her life hasn't changed. The end of Season 4. It's finally here. I'll just throw my cards on the table. This episode is almost perfect. To start, I really like the story. I like how it's being addressed that Twilight being a princess really hasn't changed much. I mean, I'm kinda glad it didn't because it gave us time for it to sink in. But after a whole season of it only marginally being addressed, and oftentimes being completely forgotten, it is nice to see this arc of her being a princess finally moving forward. But the story goes quite a bit deeper off from that. We also learn of this villain who escaped from Tartarus, apparently after the events of It's About Time, which, yeah, it's a good callback, and a good bit of continuity. And unlike a Canterlot wedding, we actually get to hear his name. As for the villain himself, I mean, he does his part well enough. I remember hearing though that T-Rex is a villain that came from Generation 1 of My Little Pony. So yeah, this guy's a veteran. His ability to steal magic from other ponies and his aim to steal all the magic from Equestria so he can rule it does offer some good tension. It leads to a pretty cool fight scene also where Twilight and T-Rex duke it out in Ponyville. To be honest, out of context, I would not believe you if you told me this was from My Little Pony Ball cartoons. And joining him is Discord, who is returning to the dark side. And overall, his character develops massively from this episode. If you were suspicious of Discord after he come and float around like I was, yeah, all the animosity and distrust towards him from the main 6 did not do any favors. But seeing him betray his friends, and especially Fluttershy, just to get stabbed in the back himself, this is a reformation I can get behind. It's a big moment for Twilight too, you know, the same pony that traveled to the ends of Equestria just to see Discord get better. Seriously? That has to be the absolute strongest display of mercy I've ever seen. But oh Discord, you just gotta pity the fool. Oh yeah, we finally get to see what was inside that chest that was being built up this entire season. And we also now know what Twilight's part is gonna be throughout Equestria too, spreading friendship across the entire land. I guess I should also mention this episode has some good humor in it too. Like the moment when Rainbow Dash is recounting the events of Rainbow Falls, and Pinkie Pie just cuts her off. It's funny because Pinkie Pride is an awesome episode, but Rainbow Falls sucks. As for the writing within the story, it's very tight. Honestly, the way the writer did write this episode makes me feel like she was paying very special attention to continuity here. There are some judgments within the story that can be difficult to swallow, but I'm already used to trying to rationalize the stories in all these episodes anyway. Really, there is only one thing I don't really understand. Twilight knows that Discord stabbed her and her friends in the back, but she doesn't think to tell any of her friends about that. If Twilight could think to tell her friends to tell everyone around to stay hidden because of T-Rex being on the loose, you'd think she'd at least mention Discord helping him. Everything else I can buy. Princess Celestia's plan? Obviously out of pure desperation. What else could she really do? Missing the stained glass window that depicts Twilight. Again, I can buy that. Because at the very least, Princess Celestia was on the right track about keeping Twilight hidden. She just managed to miss that. She's not perfect, we can expect that she'll miss some details. T-Rex not killing the ponies directly in front of him. Again, I can buy that too. What good is being a god if you have no subjects to rule over? But that's about the only flaw I can find in this episode. Yes, the ending is rather anticlimactic, especially given the massive fight that happened before it, but this whole show is basically just a massive toy commercial, so be it. Also, I know I'm not alone on this, but the castle design is absolutely hideous. It feels like I'm actively being flipped off. Just one more thing to talk about, and that's the songs. At least the first one. I really like it. In a story sense, it's Twilight venting how she feels like her role as a princess really has not changed her life at all. She wants to be grateful, but she feels like she doesn't really contribute anything. Her friends try to cheer her up earlier in the episode when she first vents to them, but then she actually does her duty, and yeah, she feels those feelings all over again. Which, when all you do is smile and wave, yeah, you'd be wanting for more too, I can already guarantee it. Celestia, Luna, and Cadence reassuring her that her role as a princess will be important, it's also very nice, mostly because they're taking her feelings seriously. You gotta love, by the way, how Princess Luna seems to understand where Twilight's coming from the most, though my interpretation of that lyric may be ill-founded. But all in all, great episode. Absolutely adored it. I don't think it's quite up to the level of Hurricane Fluttershy or Less Than Zero, but this is easily the best two-parter we've gotten so far. Farewell, Season 4. It's been fun. And that is every episode of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic Season 4 reviewed. Wow, that was fun. Before we go to the pie chart, I think it's safe to say, just looking at all the episodes we thought were good, and how few episodes we thought were bad or even okay, this was an easy good season. There were just so many episodes I downright adored. It's honestly going to make it extremely hard to decide what my true best 5 and worst 5 episodes are. But that's for later. So let's look at the pie chart. We had 16 good episodes, 3 okay episodes, and 5 nightmare episodes. And that's for those good episodes. Keep in mind that Twilight's Kingdom and Princess Twilight Sparkle are included in that. So technically it's like 18 good episodes. That's more than 75% of the season that was good. It honestly feels like this show is finally coming into its own, and if this keeps up, I'm very excited for Season 5. Speaking of which, before we get into my notes, I want to announce I have another channel called Phantom Bee, which I'll link in the description of this video. On that channel, I want to do more reviews on My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, but on specific episodes. And there may even be some top 5 and top 10 lists, who knows. The point of doing episode reviews there, though, is because this channel is tied to my Phantom A channel, which I use for my Paper Mario content and Bug Fables content. And I don't want to risk copyright strikes on this channel. So if you haven't yet, please subscribe to that one, and thank you in advance. Alright, on to some notes I have. Let's start off with the arc of the Equestria Games. It wasn't very good. Look, if I'm being real, Games Ponies Play could very well have been a nightmare episode, because aside from it just being really funny, it didn't really have anything going for it. The story was all over the place, and in some aspects, it did not even make any sense. Heck, the only good episode that's not Equestria Games was Fight to the Finish, an episode that had little to nothing to do with the games themselves. And Rainbow Falls was, well, abysmal. Honestly, with this in mind, it's kind of impressive they went the route they did for the Equestria Games with Spike being the main focus. If that episode did poorly, my goodness, would that have been a catastrophe on the showrunners. Hopping up this event from the very previous season just for there to be no real payoff. I feel like this arc really needed there to be only one writer behind it all, instead of having like Corey Powell get involved when Dave Posey was already writing the first and last episode. Moving on, Pinkie Pie was very annoying for most of the first half, and well, Filli Vanilli. Like, in episodes like Princess Twilight Sparkle and Three's a Crowd, I genuinely start to wonder what she contributes to the stories that she's actually involved in. Granted, she's not annoying in every episode. In fact, there are a fair few episodes where she's involved in where I like her but don't like the episode itself. And the episodes featuring Pinkie Pie as the main character are all really good. It's actually an inverse of Season 2, where I hated all of Pinkie Pie's episodes in that season, but I actually like all of Pinkie's episodes in Season 4. Hopefully in Season 5 we'll get the best of both worlds. Next up, the box from the Tree of Harmony and the episodes surrounding that. They were all pretty solid for the most part. With the exception of Rainbow Falls and Leap of Faith, they were all good. If I had to rank them all in terms of quality, it'd be Rainbow Dash at the bottom, she has the absolute worst one. Then Applejack, because hers was legitimately boring to me. Fourth would be Fluttershy, because despite liking that episode a lot, I did have genuine problems with the characterization. Third was Rarity, whose episode was just all around very solid. The second place would have to be Twilight, for only having one real flaw in an otherwise very exciting episode. And finally Pinkie Pie, who has an episode that's practically perfect. All around, I see the season did pretty well for itself with this arc. So hey, if the show tries to do this again in the future, I'm for it. I guess I'm in the minority for this, but I'm actually kind of glad that Twilight being a princess did not affect much in the show early on. Cause it's a very big deal to change the status quo like that, and having to just accept that this is the new reality for Twilight could be very jarring. I just appreciated having the time for it to really sink in. Even though if we're being real, what Twilight would be doing as a princess from here on out would be pretty predictable. Like, what else would she be than the princess of friendship? My next note is that sadly, we finally have an episode that's actually bad featuring Rarity. I mean, yeah, there's Look Before You Sleep, an episode I actively hate, but that episode featured both Rarity and Applejack about the same. Meanwhile, I'd say Simple Ways primarily focuses on Rarity as a character than anything else. A shame it had to happen at all, but I guess it had to happen eventually. And better late than early, right? Who knows? Before long, Fluttershy will have a bad episode, and then we consider that every character has a bad episode at least once. And finally, the issues I had with episodes like Keep Calm and Flutter On and The Friend Indeed were actually addressed in Season 4. Yeah, this is a more personal note, but it's something I think is worth noting at least. The problem I had with Keep Calm and Flutter On was actually addressed in episodes like Three's a Crowd and Twilight's Kingdom. The former confirmed that I was right about Fluttershy being actually fair to Discord, and the latter actually wrapped up its reformation in a meaningful way. As far as A Friend Indeed, it actually taught the moral about how you cannot hope to befriend everybody and you shouldn't try to. And it still had a very sweet ending, which confirms in my mind that yeah, A Friend Indeed could have been better, it could have actually been good. But right now, I'm just happy seeing it being addressed here. Alright, time for my worst 5 and best 5 episodes of Season 4. As always, we're ending this video on a high note. Let's start with the worst half. Number 5, Simple Ways. It was honestly a toss-up between this episode and Leap of Faith. But at the very least, Leap of Faith did not tease any jokes just to not follow through with them all the way. And Rarity's character in Simple Ways was not done any favors at all. Number 4, Treja. The main conflict of this episode is just very poorly communicated. It feels like despite the fact that it's Rainbow Dash that really wants this thing, it's Fluttershy that's the main focus. And it makes the issues of Fluttershy's lack of self-assertion very, very clear. Which is really bad when so many episodes before this one have been trying to establish that Fluttershy is trying to assert herself more. The only things keeping this episode from making higher are the other subplots. Number 3, Rainbow Falls. The quality of writing in this episode is absolutely abysmal. If the dialogue isn't redundant and unnecessary, then it actively detracts from the characterization of the actual characters. Not to mention, Rainbow Dash is uncharacteristically stupid in this episode. Because the way the conflict is framed, it seems as if she's actively handicapping herself, and with what's on the line, it just looks very irresponsible on her part. Number 2, Somepony to Watch Over Me. I think the most disappointing thing about this episode is just how it could not have possibly worked. Not because of bad writing, but because what we do know about Applejack could not have been revealed this early on in the show. But even that does not excuse the absolutely pitiful delivery of the moral, the horrible implications surrounding the moral, and the honestly very easy methods to figure out to avoid the conflicts within this episode. This has to be some of the worst writing we've seen in all of Season 4. And at number 1, Power Ponies. Yep. Once again, a Spike episode is at number 1 of this list. You know, speaking of implications, imagine the implications of thinking about how Spike is only useful if the main 6 are completely and entirely incompetent. Honestly, I think this episode could have actually worked if only one thing was changed. If this episode focused more on the relationship between Spike and Fluttershy, I think this could have had a lot of potential to be very, very good. Because there, you'd have both your boys and your girls actively working together and uplifting each other. But the way the writers wrote this episode, it's as if Spike is only useful when his friends are useless. Which in reality is actually extremely counterintuitive to what you're trying to tell as far as a story. Of all the worst episodes on this list, this one makes me the most angry, mostly because of how much potential it had, and it got completely squandered. Whew, that was fun. And now for my favorite 5 episodes of Season 4. And just saying, this is subject to change, because I know for a fact that with episodes this good all around, I can't really choose a definitive favorite. But let's at least try, right? Number 5, Maud Pie. This was a very impressive episode. Not only did it have great humor, but it did a moral I really wanted to see in a previous episode masterfully well. And it still manages to be very sweet, which is really saying something because the humor in this episode is so dry. Number 4, For Whom the Sweetie Belle Toils. Dream episodes are just so cool in my opinion. And this episode has some very cool visuals. The story is also one that hits pretty close to home. But most importantly, I just really like episodes where both Sweetie Belle and Rarity are the focus. And it was also really cool seeing the parallels between Sweetie Belle and Princess Luna. All around, this episode is just very sharp writing. Number 3, Twilight's Kingdom. I can really count the problems with this episode on just one finger. And while, yeah, it's a pretty big problem, I love how well communicated the story is in this episode. It has surprisingly good acting for this show's target demographic, and it answers some very big questions, both pertaining to Discord and to Twilight's future. All around, I'm satisfied. Number 2, Equestria Games. This honestly might be the most personal episode on this list. Features one of my absolute favorite morals in the entire show so far, and it really captures the feeling of wanting to live up to others' expectations, but just not feeling you're worthy. I'm really happy this episode turned out the way it did. And at number 1, Pinkie Pride. The most energetic, exciting, and all-around epic episode in all of Season 4. Not only did this episode do extremely good favor to Pinkie Pie's character, but in its own right, this episode is practically stone perfect. The only problem I really have with this episode is a joke that did not make any sense to me. But as for the positives, it's a musical with absolutely great music. It has a celebrity guest actually used to its fullest potential. The characterization to every character in the show is absolutely spot on. Dare I say it, whenever I think of this episode, I just get very happy. Pinkie Pride captures exactly what Pinkie Pie is all about. If I had just one wish, please give us more of this, Pinkie Pie. I know it's not my birthday, but please, just give us a good Pinkie Pie like this in more episodes. With that all said and done, thank you to Ricardo for being a channel member for $10 a month. If you want to be a channel member, look down below and, click the join button. I'll see you next time for Season 5. Take care, everybody.